Iran is not interested in resuming negotiations with the United States right now. That could change if Washington demonstrates in some meaningful way that it is serious about reaching an agreement. But if negotiations resume, Iran will demand more than what was contained in the MOU. It will be more specific about Yemen, more specific about Gaza, and it will want certain things up front to make sure the same situation does not happen again. We have to remember what happened with the previous agreement. From day one, the United States violated its commitments. It was supposed to release Iran's stolen assets, but it refused to do so. It was supposed to refrain from expanding the sanctions regime, yet the sanctions were expanded. The United States was also supposed to force the Israelis to leave Lebanon and end the war, but the Israeli regime did not budge. Washington was supposed to remove the sanctions on Iranian oil exports. It did so for only a few days and then reversed course. Eventually, the situation reached the point where the United States violated Article 5 by opening its own corridor in the Strait of Hormuz. The agreement was clear about the arrangement in the strait. Iran was supposed to have control during that period, and the United States was not named in Article 5. Iran was also supposed to normalize trade. Instead, after days of warnings from Iran, the United States, together with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Emirates, opened a separate corridor. The failure of those countries to listen to Iran's warnings had consequences. Iran hit 3 ships, and then the United States relaunched the war. What is extraordinary is that we were already entering the second month of the MOU. If the United States had simply refrained from opening its own corridor in violation of the agreement, trade through the Strait of Hormuz would have been normalized by this point. Even though the United States had failed to carry out its other commitments, the situation could have been very different if Washington had simply waited a few more days. By the second month, trade through the Strait of Hormuz was supposed to be operating normally, as it had before the war. But Trump refused to do that. He wanted to undermine Iran instead of reaching a decent agreement, and now we are moving closer and closer to a crisis. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz has become particularly serious. Last night, I believe the United States attempted to get 6 ships through the strait. Iran hit 2 of them, while the other 4 retreated. There was also another important development. If I'm not mistaken, a tanker from Qatar carrying LNG passed through the Iranian corridor on its way to Pakistan. The Americans have now blocked that tanker because it used the Iranian corridor. That is particularly striking because Pakistan is an American ally. Yet even a vessel carrying LNG from Qatar to Pakistan can become caught up in this confrontation simply because it passed through the Iranian-controlled corridor. This shows how quickly the situation can escalate when agreements are violated and warnings are ignored. The issue is no longer simply about negotiations between Washington and Tehran. It is affecting regional trade, shipping, and countries that are not directly participating in the conflict. The central problem is that Iran has already learned what happens when it accepts commitments without sufficient guarantees. The previous agreement was supposed to create a path toward normalization, but the United States failed to fulfill its obligations. Iran's stolen assets were not released, the sanctions regime was expanded, and the promised pressure on Israel did not produce the withdrawal from Lebanon or an end to the war. Even the issue of Iranian oil exports demonstrated how unreliable those commitments could be. The sanctions were lifted briefly and then restored. So, if there is going to be another negotiation, Iran will naturally demand something more concrete. It will want specific commitments concerning Yemen and Gaza, and it will want certain measures implemented in advance rather than simply being promised for the future. That is particularly important because the Strait of Hormuz was supposed to become normalized under the agreement. If Washington had respected the arrangement and refrained from creating its own corridor, normal trade could have resumed. Instead, the decision to open a separate corridor, despite repeated Iranian warnings, changed the situation completely. The consequences are now visible. Ships are attempting to move through the strait, some are being struck, and others are forced to retreat. A Qatari LNG tanker traveling toward Pakistan was also blocked by the Americans because it had used the Iranian corridor. These developments demonstrate why Iran would approach any future negotiations with much greater caution. The issue is not simply whether Washington is willing to talk. The real question is whether the United States is prepared to demonstrate through its actions that any agreement it signs will actually be respected. If the United States wants negotiations to resume, it will have to demonstrate seriousness through actions rather than simply making promises. Iran has already seen what happens when commitments are made and then abandoned. That experience will inevitably shape the conditions for any future agreement. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz makes this even more urgent. The strait is not an isolated issue. It is a major route for regional trade and energy shipments, so decisions made there can quickly affect countries far beyond Iran and the United States. When ships are prevented from passing, when vessels are attacked, and when commercial traffic is disrupted, the consequences spread across the region. The fact that a Qatari LNG tanker traveling toward Pakistan could be blocked because it used the Iranian corridor illustrates how complicated the situation has become. Pakistan may be an American ally, but that did not prevent its interests from being affected by the confrontation. This is why Iran's position cannot simply be reduced to whether it wants to negotiate or not. Iran has already experienced an agreement in which American commitments were not honored. Any future negotiations will therefore involve much more specific demands and much stronger expectations about what must happen before Iran makes further commitments. The United States could have avoided much of the current escalation by respecting the existing arrangement and allowing the process to continue. Instead, the decision to open a separate corridor in the Strait of Hormuz, despite repeated warnings, helped push the situation toward renewed conflict. At this point, the path toward negotiations depends largely on whether Washington is willing to change its approach. If the United States demonstrates that it is genuinely prepared to respect an agreement, Iran could reconsider negotiations. But it will not simply return to the previous arrangement and trust American promises again. Any future agreement will have to take into account everything that has happened since the previous MOU. Iran will not simply look at what is written on paper, it will look at whether the United States is actually prepared to carry out its commitments, because the experience so far has shown that an agreement means very little if one side can violate it without consequence. That is why issues such as Yemen and Gaza will become much more important in any future negotiations. Iran will want greater specificity, and it will likely demand concrete steps up front. The objective would be to prevent another situation in which commitments are made, only to be abandoned shortly afterward. The same principle applies to the Strait of Hormuz. The agreement provided a framework for normalizing trade, but the opening of a separate American corridor changed the situation. Iran had warned against it for days, and when those warnings were ignored, the confrontation escalated. Ships were struck, others retreated, and the United States ultimately relaunched the war. Now even commercial shipping connected to American allies is being affected. A Qatari LNG tanker heading toward Pakistan was blocked after using the Iranian corridor. That tells us how serious the situation has become and how easily regional trade can become part of the confrontation. So the question is not simply whether negotiations are possible. They are possible if the United States demonstrates that it is serious. But Iran will approach them from a completely different position than before. It will demand more precise commitments, concrete measures, and evidence that those commitments will actually be honored. Without that, there is little reason for Iran to return to the same arrangement. The previous experience has already demonstrated the danger of relying on promises alone, and the current crisis is a direct consequence of those broken commitments. What matters now is whether the United States understands that another agreement cannot simply repeat the structure of the previous one. Iran will look at the record of what happened, not just at new promises made around a negotiating table. If Washington wants a different outcome, it has to demonstrate that difference through its behavior. For Iran, negotiations are therefore not about returning to the past. They are about establishing conditions under which an agreement can actually survive. That means addressing the issues that were left unresolved, providing concrete guarantees, and avoiding actions that directly undermine the agreement while negotiations are taking place. The experience of the Strait of Hormuz is particularly important because it shows how quickly trust can disappear. Once one side believes the other is violating the arrangement, every subsequent action is interpreted through that lens. The result is greater suspicion, greater pressure, and eventually a much more dangerous confrontation. If the United States genuinely wants diplomacy, then it has an opportunity to demonstrate that through its actions. Iran can negotiate when it sees a serious commitment to an agreement, but it will not ignore the lessons of the past. The next negotiation, if it happens, will therefore be much more demanding. Iran will want specific commitments, concrete steps, and evidence that those commitments will be respected. That is the only realistic foundation for rebuilding trust and preventing the same cycle from repeating itself.